Awesome. So are we ready to get started with the presentation, Josh? Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay. I'm a dual title PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies and psychology, primarily social psychology. And I'm really excited to chat with everyone today about things that I've learned about doing research with LGBTQIA plus populations. But before we get started, I do want to thank, if everyone can, like in the chat, thank Josh and Haley Troy for joining us today. So Josh Harden is going to be our IT today, and he's been super helpful. And Haley Troy has been doing all the behind the scenes work. And without their help today, this webinar wouldn't be possible. Okay, so for today's agenda, I am going to cover some of the best practices to use when conducting research with LGBTQI populations. So first, I'm going to go over heterosexist bias in research and what that is, what is sexual and gender diversity, and some theories that you can cite in your own research. Then we'll talk about measuring sexual orientation, and then I'll briefly go over research design and recruitment. And at the conclusion of the presentation, I'll share with you some of the resources that I talked about today. So on the right-hand side here, you can see these rainbow arrows, and that's just to sort of orient you towards where we're at in the presentation. So you'll just be following along with the rainbow. And so as we get closer to purple, you'll know that the webinar is starting to end. And that's just to help everybody understand sort of where we're at. So first, I wanted to start today about, why are we concerned? Why should we worry about conducting research with LGBTQ plus populations? Why is this something that should be on our radar with research? And first of all, I just wanted to start off with, there are often discrepancies between people's thoughts, behaviors, fantasies, their spoken or acknowledged identities, and other aspects of their being. We also know from Lisa Diamond's research that a substantial amount of people experience sexual fluidity in their lifetime. And also, Gallup polls are showing that a record number of adults now identify as LGBTQ plus, and nearly 1 in 5 or 20% of young adults are now identifying within the LGBTQ plus community, with bisexuality or non-monosexual identities being the most common. So what is heterosexist bias in research? So Gregory Herrick, who's a researcher who you should look up and know work about if you're interested in doing work with LGBTQ plus populations, is that heterosexist bias is basically conceptualizing the human experience strictly in terms of heterosexual behavior, which often ignores or invalidates or even derogates non-heterosexual behaviors, sexual orientations, or other aspects of LGBTQ plus lifestyles. Within research, we often use heterosexuality as the norm, and this is sort of where our center of academic theorizing happens. But as I'm about to show you, heterosexism can occur at every level of the research process, from our research questions to our journal outlets. So I have this quote here by a paper by McClelland and Dutcher that came out in 2016, but I think it's a really great quote that not only captures heterosexism, but things like allocentrism and also cisgender bias, right? So allocentrism is basically people who experience sexual attraction, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But heterosexism stems from the assumption that heterosexuality is natural, universal, and therefore inevitable, and that every other identity is assumed to not be natural, universal, or inevitable. And so the way that this can kind of occur in our research, and I've provided some examples about different stages in the research process where we see this, is starting with our research question. So it's the assumption that sexual, romantic, or gender is the primary source of group difference rather than something environmental like discrimination, for example. This can also be ignoring the positive aspects of being LGBTQ plus. So while it's really, really important to document the ways that people are oppressed or suffering, only asking questions from a deficit perspective or sort of like what's wrong, what's going wrong with LGBTQ plus people does have a marginalizing effect because it isn't showing us the varied experiences of this group of people. So within sampling, I sort of have 2 points here, is the presumption or the assumption that participants are heterosexual, allosexual, so that they are people who experience sexual attraction, or cisgender, people that are whose gender identity is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth, is a really sort of simple way of explaining that. And so often in research, we sort of assume that that is who we are sampling. And then often we assume that there are only a few LGBTQ plus people in a community. And that might be the reason why we're not asking about sexual orientation or looking at this variable when we do research, right? Within the research design, it can be things like asking questions that only certain people can answer. So for example, often when we ask about marital status, we aren't asking about people who have polyamorous relationships or other types of relationships. We're typically talking about people who are married, single, widowed. And so we give people a really restricted range from what they can choose from. Another sort of heterosexist bias that might occur in research is in the creation of intervention content that might imply that people are heterosexual, allosexual, or cisgender. So one example that I've provided here is using sexual activity as an indicator of relationship health. So for example, asexual people can have perfectly healthy relationships, or even people who maybe have painful sex, or for other reasons have found other ways to be intimate with their partners that are not sexual. So sometimes the measures that we use can actually be quite exclusive to other people. So within our analyses, we can also do things like positioning LGBTQ plus people as the effect to be explained. So what this sort of looks like is that when we do our comparisons, we often spend most of our discussion sections or our theorizing trying to understand why LGBTQ plus people might be different than heterosexual, cisgender, or allocentric people, and spending a way less time explaining why, for example, heterosexual people might be acting the way that they do. So dominant group members, their behavior requires just as much explanation. So we don't want to be pushing people to the margins by assuming that they're the ones who need to be explained. And so another sort of way in our analyses that we can reinforce heterosexist bias is by excluding LGBTQ plus people from the analysis and providing no justification. Now, as researchers, we all have to make decisions and we can't do everything with one study, but we should be transparent and justify why we've made the decisions that we did. So that way we can also improve research in later years. So that way people understand exactly what happened in our research. So transparency is really important. And then on the research dissemination side, to like kind of close things off, is that the idea that research about heterosexual, cisgender, or allosexual people is the most generalizable, the most relevant, and the most useful. And this idea often pushes research about LGBTQ plus populations into specialized journals, as if there is that we can't learn anything from this outside of the niche, right? And that's just not true. Epistemologies from all different groups can be very informative. So moving into how we define sexual orientation and gender identity, I'm going to present to you sort of two slides to sort of broadly introduce this concept. And then I'm going to be going into some other theories that you might be able to cite in your own work. So first of all, sexual orientation and gender are multifaceted. Everything that I'm going to be talking about today is on a spectrum. There really aren't binaries that we're going to be thinking about today. So sexuality, gender, and sex are distinct, but they are also related, but they are often conflated, right? So for example, trans people can be heterosexual and then they wouldn't be sexual minorities, even if they're still gender minorities. And it's also important to know that straight and or cis people, and also allosexual people have genders and sexual orientations, and that also impacts their behavior. Often when we think about sexual orientation, what immediately comes to mind is LGBTQ plus people. But as I mentioned before, heterosexual people, cis people, allosexual people also have behaviors that require explanation. I also wanted to point out that it can be difficult to measure all of the facets of sexual orientation and gender identity, but we typically measure them in terms of attraction, behavior, and identity. But there are other things in your research that we can be looking at, like partner number, preferences for gender expression, thoughts or fantasies, sexual preferences, and other sorts of aspects of sexual orientation and gender identity. So just sort of a quick intro to LGBTQIA is each letter stands for a unique group. And so that's, as a researcher, that's going to show us that there are within and across group variations. And then there are also other sources of variation like race, ability, culture, all of those sorts of things are impacting, like, to create a very varied group of people that we often lump together. So sexual diversity, when I refer to sexual diversity, I'm talking about the different ways of experiencing and expressing sexuality. So as I mentioned before, this can be things simply as sexual preferences, people's thoughts, their behavior, the types of sexual activity they prefer, and also solitary sexual activity. And just to further define allosexual, so that's people who experience sexual attraction. And then on this spectrum, we have asexual people who experience little or no sexual attraction. So within gender diversity, there are different ways of expressing and experiencing gender. So that can be sort of gender identity like man or woman, and also things like stud, femme, and butch, which also convey gender expression. And also importantly, sexuality and gender are not fixed. Our preferences, expressions, and self-concept can change over time. So to go into some theories about thinking about sexual and gender diversity, I wanted to present sexual configurations theory, which is a theory that Sari Van Anders and her lab have been working on for years. And don't worry so much about these citations right now. Those things will be put in the chat for you, so you can just sort of follow along. So sexual configurations theory, or SCT, is a very broad and comprehensive framework for thinking about sexual and gender diversity. So in this theory, it considers things like partner number, allosexuality, asexuality, non-monogamy, eroticism, so whether relationships are more sexual in nature, and nurturance, whether they're more nurturing. It also considers gender and sex, as well as other aspects of sexuality, so things like kink or shared experiences like culture and race. And really importantly, within sexual configurations theory is that intersectionality is built into this theory. Is that the idea is that sexual configurations are not really isolated from other facets of identity or even other aspects of the human experience. So I wanted to show you all this page of Sari Van Anders' zine about sexual configurations theory. And you can see just from, so first of all, she has a really cool zine they have a very cool zine that sort of details this theory in a very easy to understand way, right? And so you can see here in the top left corner, we have someone saying, kink is by far the most important feature of my sexuality. I want erotic and nurturing relationships with dominant people, and I don't care what gender they are. And then in the bottom right, we have someone saying, as a Black woman living in the US, I'm only interested in dating other people of color who understand my lived experiences. And these are often aspects of people's relationships that we don't typically consider in research when we're conducting research with LGBTQ plus populations. So getting into intersectionality, this is something that I wanted to define. Even though it's a term that a lot of people are familiar with, I still wanted to talk about how this is a theory that, originated in Black feminist thought as a way of conceptualizing the unique experiences of Black women. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, has this really great quote here that I think can help us understand it better in our research, is where intersectionality is a lens where you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. So it's not just adding identities together. It's not simply there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, or a class or LGBTQ problem. Many times those frameworks erases what happens to people who are the subject of things. And on this wheel of intersectionality, you can see that there are all sorts of power, privilege, and identities that are impacting people. So things like age, fertility, refugee status, trauma history, class background, gender. There are so many different things that are impacting people. And then on top of that, we have more systemic forces. So things like racism, homophobia, ageism. And then on top of that, we have historical forces like capitalism, war, immigration, colonization. And so when we think about intersectionality, I really want to encourage us to think about it broadly and also think about it thoughtfully. So what sort of power is impacting our participants' lives? Another sort of extension or theory of intersectionality that I wanted to introduce is intersectional invisibility. So this is from Purdy Vons and Ebach in 2008, where we're thinking about how marginalized members or members of marginalized groups can become marginalized within those groups. And I promise I'll make that a little clearer in a second. So typically, Group members who are marginalized within marginalized groups are not the prototype of the respective identity group, right? So often we approach research from an androcentric perspective, where men are thought of the default person, and then also an ethnocentric perspective, where white people are thought of the default person. And so then when we think of a gay person, we're often thinking of a white gay man. And sort of to expand on this a little bit more, how there are marginalized members of marginalized groups that we need to consider when we're conducting research with any group. So for example, women, we're often thinking about white women. So even when people say things like women and people of color, that can sort of create this intersectional invisibility for women of color. So within people of color, we're often thinking of men, and then sort of marginalizing women of color or sexual and gender minorities of color. And so the idea with intersectional invisibility is that people with multiple subordinate group identities are not the prototype of their respective identity groups, which ends up making their experiences invisible, and their unique experiences are often overlooked because group prototypes are centered in knowledge production. So, I wanted to take a moment and just take a poll. You can use the QR code here on the left, but I wanted everyone to sort of generate other aspects. Now that we've talked about a lot of these concepts, other aspects of sexuality, identity, and gender that we can measure. Maybe these are some things that you actually have noticed that are that might be some things that you might want to consider in your own research, but I just wanted to do some group-based knowledge production. So if everyone can just use a QR code and just start, it's an anonymous sort of poll. You can start generating some ideas for all of us here about other aspects that we can be measuring. Very interesting, yeah. Nice. So just how people, so it sounds like some people are coming up with some things about like relationship, what's going on in the relationship, the intimacy, but also orientation. So affectional orientation, ability, that's something that we often overlook. So whether like internal versus interpersonal aspects, country of origin, gray ace, that's part of the asexual spectrum, aromantic, it looks like people are really thinking outside allosexuality right now, current gender of partner, cultural attitudes towards sexual orientation. That's very interesting. So that's getting into that broader sort of ecosystem of sexual orientation. Spirituality, culture, those things are certainly going to be impacting how people experience their lives. Mental health, discrimination. Traditional food preferences, very interesting. Yeah, worldview, experiences of stigma, maybe even aspects of people's health or their biology. Kink, I see someone mentioned BDSM, how people cope, maybe cope with stress. Yeah, how central their identity is, very interesting. So history with their family of origin. So relationship hierarchy and polyamory. Appearance. And we're just going to let a few more people go. So let's we'll give it until 11:20. So let's everybody finish their thoughts. But I think that you all can start to see here that we actually can come up together with a lot of different things that we can measure that we're typically not measuring in our standard demographic questions. Social network, whether the relationships are open or not. All right. And so it looks like we have 2 people who are participating and 1 last person. All right. It looks like the poll has closed. So yeah, I mean, like when we look at this, we're seeing this big constellation of different sorts of facets that we can measure that have a lot to do with the way that people experience their identities. So this is a great segue into measuring sexual orientation. So first of all, it is important to stay up to date with terms, and new terms are emerging all of the time. Now, a lot of people ask me how you stay up to date with the terms, and part of that is actually just self-education. And I have provided some resources for people to be able to do that self-education today. So in addition to Sari Van Ander's work, there are other sorts of institutes that can be really, really helpful for you, and also provide a lot of guidance on measuring sexual orientation and gender diversity. many measurements actually use outdated and offensive language, and that's something to be very aware of when we're using our measures. And unfortunately, relying on NIH-validated demographic questions doesn't necessarily avoid these issues. And to complicate things, there really isn't a uniformly accepted measure of sexual orientation or gender identity, but I will be providing you all with some that are used by these authoritative bodies to think about sexual and gender diversity. But before I wanted to get started on those measures, I did want to talk about what are the preferences of LGBTQ plus people. So expanded formats with lots of options tend to be what is most preferred, and also using modern and contemporary terminology. So there's some work by Jess Matzik and her team that show that lesbian and gay people prefer words like lesbian or gay rather than using the word homosexual. That sort of has like a very pathologizing connotation and also very stigmatizing history. And people ask me all of the time whether this will change the experiences of heterosexual people in their sample. And interestingly, heterosexual people are largely unaffected by differently formatted questions. People are pretty used to being asked about these things. The NIH also has some guidelines for gender identity that we should be using in our own work, especially if we're doing health research. So using things like affirmed gender is more proper than using things like not preferred or affirmed gender, other than using things like not preferred gender or chosen gender or lifestyle. It's also more proper to say things like transgender, not transgendered, transgenderism, transsexual, or transvestite. And then we also refer to people who are transitioning as very simply that, transition or transitioning rather than transgendering, sex change, or sex reassignment surgery. This link below is also going to be provided for you in the chat, but I just wanted to show you all where I was getting that. And why are labels important? And one of the things I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is that labels can impact the expression of sexual prejudice, and it might even change the way that people are interpreting your research. So in general, people are less likely to support homosexuals in the military than when policy uses words like gay men and lesbians. And then another sort of policy example is that when using words like lesbian or gay, these labelings yield less sexual prejudice than exposure to the term like homosexuals among people high in right-wing authoritarianism. So getting into the nitty-gritty about how we can measure this, it's always good to have multiple choice options, so giving people a lot of options, but also providing write-in options. So that way people can self-identify if they don't feel included in your measure. We can use things like continuous measures. Now, the measures that I'm presenting to you in these examples are available from those resources that I told you. So don't worry too much about response options. You will have those resources. I'm just kind of going through some examples here. So some examples of a continuous measure would be asking people like, how romantically attracted are you to cisgender women? Or how romantically attracted are you to men? Something like that. That would be a more continuous measure. We often use categorical measures. What I often like to do with categorical measures is ask people multiple questions, which I'll show you in a second, to understand participant experiences. We can ask people about their trans experience. I also like to use words like current, so the way I can locate these temporally for participants. Current gender identity, current sexual orientation, and sex assigned at birth. Also make sure that you include intersex when we're asking about sex assigned at birth, and also allow people to have a write-in option so that way they can share with you if their options aren't represented there. And it's sort of an example of a categorical question might be like, in the past, have you had sex with men, women, or other genders? And here's some example measures of sex. So for example, you could ask, like, were you born with a variation in your physical sex characteristics? This is sometimes referred to as being intersex or having a difference, diversion, or variation in your sexual development. And then you can provide them with like open-ended response options or check boxes. You can also ask your participants about their anatomy. So you can say, do you have X body part? To the best of your knowledge, are you capable of X physiological function? You can also ask people if there were no barriers or negative consequences of doing so, what would your legal sex be? And ask them something like that. We can also use the two-step method for measuring gender. So In part one, you could ask participants what their current gender identity is and provide a ton of different options for them to choose, and then still include the write-in box just in case, so that way participants are able to answer to the best of their abilities. And then in part two, you can ask about gender modality. So gender modality is the relationship that someone has to their current gender and the gender that they were assigned at birth or were socialized with. So for example, you can ask, are you a person with gender transition history or experience? And then define it for your participants. A person of trans experience is a person who has socially or medically transitioned in the process, including those who don't use the words trans as an identification term. And then you can give them response options. And then you can also ask people simply what their sex was assigned at birth using open-ended or check boxes and providing them with write-in options. And here is a measure of sexual orientation. So again, we're using the word current. So asking people what best represents how they're thinking of themselves currently and providing a lot of response options. This question even has response logic based off of how people identify their ethnicity or race. And you can see here, there's actually a lot of stuff going on. We can also measure behavior. So we can ask people in the past to specify a time period just to orient your participants to that. Who have you had sex with? Men only, women only, both men and women. And then I also added here other options like non-binary genders or agender. Something that I also wanted to point out is just thought questions here is, were these questions perfect? Do they have biases? Are they perfectly inclusive? And who is being excluded? I noted often, even though that these measures are used by our most authoritative bodies, there's still biases in these. These are not perfect. And these are things that we should be talking about in limitation sections and our discussion sections, so that way we can help improve our research as a whole, because biases still exist in even our most recommended measures. And so there's still this need for research and to improve even on our current measures. And that's sort of what I was talking about, how, even using the most validated measures doesn't necessarily change our relationship to trying to improve things over time and trying to be better and better advocates and allies. So briefly going into research design. So I wanted to kind of go over two really important points that people often run into when conducting research with LGBTQ plus populations is, first, select comparison groups carefully. And then also, when you are selecting those comparison groups, examine why or if LGBTQ people are the effect to be explained and why you're doing that. So like, whose behavior is requiring explanation here? Why are we doing this? And then also be very attentive to which groups you're comparing and also be thoughtful about why. So for example, are gender minorities being grouped with sexual minorities, and why are you doing that? Is it because you want to look at people, sexual and gender diversity? You want to look at it as a whole. So like, why are we doing what we're doing, and being very, very thoughtful about it. And part of the reason to be thoughtful about it is that sometimes what we see in research is that gender, sex, relationship status, and sexual orientation are being conflated. So we really want to make sure that we're not conflating these terms. Research designs, as I mentioned before, with heterosexist bias, can also sometimes implicitly assume sexual orientation, preference, or certain experiences. So for example, this is a real experimental vignette. Ask participants to imagine holding hands with their partner in a public setting. If you were doing research with people in certain states, maybe people in certain geographic locations, et cetera, but there's definitely a lot of privilege going on, because some people will not be feeling a threat manipulation, for example, by imagining holding their hands with their partner in a public setting. There are some people who actually might be experiencing psychological threat when they're experiencing this, and this might actually be changing how participants respond to your experimental manipulation. There's also, I see this a lot in research, is the assumption that married partners in heterosexual presenting relationships, or even unmarried partners in heterosexual presenting relationships, are actually heterosexual. So remember, there are people who are non-monosexual, and they can be in heterosexual presenting relationships, but there's also other reasons why people might be in heterosexual presenting relationships other than the fact that they are heterosexual, right? And this is also part of the reason why we always want to measure sexual orientation to the best of our abilities. So recruitment, don't worry, we're going to also brainstorm this on the next slide, but I've included some popular sources of recruitment for these groups. So for example, there is social media is a great way. You can use subreddits for LGBTQ plus people. I also highly recommend that you always build relationships with whatever group you are sampling from. You can use Facebook groups, Instagram, Twitter advertisements. There are LGBTQ plus community centers, bars, events, nightclubs. There's a great paper, Guillory et al. 2018, which provides a little guidance for how to do so and an example and a citation if you need to do that. And again, just like make sure you have a relationship or build a community presence so that way your knowledge production isn't super extractive of these groups. And then also targeted advertisements on Craigslist, senior centers, community buildings, grocery stores, farmers markets, gas stations, on campuses, et cetera, can also be really helpful in getting these participants into your research. So I wanted to do another poll here because I know that there's a lot of researchers in the audience, and we can also do some group brainstorming and some group knowledge productions about recruitment ideas and sources for conducting research with LGBTQ plus populations. So just like before, you can use the QR code here on the side to start sort of brainstorming what you've done or some things that you're thinking of as we're having this discussion during this webinar. Okay, yeah, so people are already chiming in with some places that they think that they can recruit from. TikTok, yep. Pride events, yeah, great. So again, social media, organizations, snowball sampling, if necessary, Discord groups, volunteer work. Yes, that's an excellent way to also build a relationship with the community. Coalitions, local organizations. Yep, cultural centers, health centers. That's right, yeah. It looks like, and we still have quite a few people participating on this poll. So I'm going to give it about 2 more minutes. So we'll end at 12:35. Prolific, yeah. So you can also use Qualtrics paneling or some other sort of service. Libraries, yeah, that's a good one. Yep, you can set up a table at an event, invite people over to your table. So looking at BDSM clubs, BDSM events, that'd be a great way if you were looking for those participants. All right, and we just have 1 more minute left. Does anyone have any ideas about building relationships with the community? I'm sure there are some people in this crowd who've done community-based participatory action research. It might be a little hard to sum up in one line, but if you think that you can, maybe that would be a great way too. Okay, yeah. So attending events, asking for their needs. It's very, very important that we get input from our stakeholders if we're doing that type of research. Yes, a community advisory board. That's excellent, excellent. Sharing your resources and your data, making sure that your relationship, that you are also giving something back to the community and it's not extractive. All right, we just have a few more participants, so we're just going to wrap up the poll here in this last minute. Yes, pay people for their time, honor and respect people's lived experiences. There is no substitute for that. And then also paying people for their expertise, online forums, public forums, panels, present your findings of the research, make sure that you're informing the community. Again, compensation and paying people. I love these responses. All right. But I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you everyone for participating and sharing some of your experiences with your colleagues. This is really great. So in conclusion, heterosexist bias exists in research. identity is really complex and fluid, and we need to be very thoughtful with the ways that we're thinking about it. We have a lot of resources to consider more affirming ways of examining and understanding sex, gender, sexual orientation, and other aspects of identity. But even our best measures still need improvement. And these are things that we should be talking about in our limitation sections and also in our discussion sections. All right, so we're at the Q&A portion of the talk. All of these resources will be put in the chat, but there are also, I have some research help here. These resources are also going to be available to you during this presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for the thoughtful discussion on this topic. We'll now open up for Q&A, and I noticed there are a couple questions posed, but feel free also if you'd like to, in addition to popping questions in the chat, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, that is fine too. So to get us started, Lauren says, this is so helpful. I'm curious if you found that any of these SOGI questions are too advanced for a specific reading age. We hear that survey questions should be at a given reading level.
Yeah, that's a really great question and always something to be mindful of. So I personally have not run into that, but I will say that this is also a reason to be collaborative in our research and make sure that we are offering manuscript positions or compensation for other researchers who can help us actually do this research. There are plenty of people who do research with LGBTQ plus populations regularly, and their expertise is something that we should be honoring and also compensating. So adding those collaborators who can help us understand whether our research design is exclusive to people with certain levels of literacy is something that a really knowledgeable collaborator can help you with. But I will say that in my experience, I haven't found that these questions are difficult for people to answer. Typically, these questions, like I said, they're used by institutes like the Williams Institute, the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is actually really geared towards youth, which often, when you're doing research with young people, there can be a lot more variation in literacy. And so a lot of these measures are already what is out there and have been tested and used with community samples. So I highly recommend using those resources because those, especially if you are worried with working with a population that does have a lot of variation in literacy, is using some measures that have been used with the group that you are interested in. All right, and please let me know if you all can totally email me if you feel like you needed a little more to answer your question. But let's go on to the next one, Haley.
Okay, great. So Emily asked, do you have suggestions for navigating participant burden when wanting to have inclusive measures?
Yeah, so pilot test your materials, seeing if there is something going on, like if people are sort of, it seems like they are getting a little more tired towards the end of their survey, testing how long your survey is taking for people. You can use, so ask your undergraduate research assistants. It's a great way to get undergraduates involved in research and understand survey design is by actually having them test and time your surveys about how long it was taking them and what the experience would be like for participants. And by piloting the materials, you can also ask your participants if there was a portion that they were really struggling with, and sort of understanding sort of people's experiences while taking your survey. All right, next question.
Hi.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so in one of your example questions, you had listed two-spirit under sexual orientation. And I actually had always thought that it was a gender rather than a sexual orientation. So I was just wondering if you have references for that or.
So that's actually a great point that you bring up. And that was actually one of the reasons why I brought up in the slide is like, are these measures perfect? Because they are not. Often we are conflating things with these measures. And these are the measures that we have. So I really encourage everybody, as I said, to be thoughtful about these things. These are things that we can mention in limitation sections. So that way we can improve research over time and be really thoughtful in considering with the ways that we are currently measuring these things for people. So yes, those things are often conflated. That is a question that has been validated by some of the resources that I was using. But yeah, I mean, we really need to start thinking about our measures, right? Even like I said, a lot of measures still use the word homosexual. Homosexual pops up a lot when we're doing this research, and it's something that we know is pathologizing and stigmatizing to these groups. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, the measure is not perfect, and this is kind of what we have.
I guess I was just wondering if like, well, I guess I'll just do my own research and see. It's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, the resources that I have here are definitely really great ways to self-educate. And Haley, next question. Is there someone else? I cannot
absolutely.
see the whole group or the whole chat, so.
No problem. So from Joseph, what do you suggest when the agency you work for does not collect data in the best way? For example, are you LGB or T?
Yeah, so navigating institutional norms, this is really tough. That's part of the reason why I've provided a lot of citations and a lot of resources, because that way you can kind of do what someone has told me before to call evidence-based complaining. So that way we can start also making some change and be change agents within our institution and also for research as a whole by citing sort of best practices by institutes and experts who are already doing this work. There's a lot of LGBTQ advocacy that we can be incorporating and building upon and honoring in our work. And so, but to get to the institutional navigation, I think to sum it up is using some of that evidence, presenting people with resources and references, so that way we can also educate and be allies in advocacy for other people. Next question. Yeah, sorry.
Wonderful. Yeah. So the next question I have, this is a big one, but how do you balance centering intersectional identities with statistical power concerns, particularly for research that's not exclusively about LGBT folks?
Yeah, this is part of the reason why I mentioned we can't do everything with one study, right? Like we are limited by stats, which stats often are not the most intersectional way of thinking about things. First of all, I encourage people to use qualitative components when they can, because typically we can get much richer context about our lives by using qualitative methods. And also, if you are bumping into limitations, if you are bumping into those things, be transparent about them with limitation sections and discussion sections. So that way, again, you can give direction to future researchers and help improve fields as a whole, but also acknowledging things that is going on. So, all right, next question.
So I'm seeing a couple people are enjoying the phrase evidence-based complaining.
Yeah, someone gave me the phrase, so it is borrowed, but I love it too, everybody. It's one of my favorite phrases now.
Anyone else have questions? There aren't any in the Q&A or in the chat right now, but feel free to unmute yourselves if you have a question that you'd like to pose. Anyone have any other questions regarding the topic or how to implement in research? All right, let's see. Yeah, so we have a question from Cindy. Is there concern that labeling individuals based on gender, sexuality, etc., may lead to divisiveness and inconsistencies with trying to fit people in these different categories that follow a certain label?
So there's always a problem when you try to categorize people. I think, as I pointed out in this presentation, that it's very hard to understand someone's entire experience by trying to push them into a category. And so I'm not sure I understand the divisiveness part of the question, but I think that what the crux of the question is there a problem with categorizing people? Yeah. Like research is a subjective process, even stats are subjective, and the decisions that we make do have impacts for how we're thinking about people, and they do have downstream consequences. Next question, if there is one.
Not seeing any right now. Jennifer Sussman commented saying, in response to Joseph, that building agency consensus is one way we found of making change. Interagency work group peer pressure or the strength in numbers concept. Love a good interagency work group. But if there are any other questions, please feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat or the Q&A.
Questions or even just useful things that you want to share with your colleagues. I know that there are a lot of people who are doing this research and have been very, very thoughtful about it, especially with community-based engaged or participatory action research. And so if you all have thoughts for your colleagues, feel free to share them.
From Melanie, do you have advice for seeking grant funding for community engaged research?
Yeah, so I think that part of the way to get grant funding is actually utilizing the expertise of colleagues that you have around you, right? So finding collaborators with expertise in LGBTQ studies or who have grant funded research and asking them about how they are doing what they're doing, and also honoring and compensating when necessary when we are asking people for their expertise, right? So often, like, researchers who are working with marginalized groups might get asked to, provide some background, maybe, how to measure sexual orientation, and we're often not compensating them for their time. And this expertise is something that takes a long time to build, right? But as far as grant funding goes, if, the APA has different types of awards for some seed funding for, so if you look at the APA divisions or even at AWP, there are different types of seed grants that we can use for LGBTQ plus research. And having that pilot data and having a history of funding can actually help you secure grant funding later. So that's also one way to go. There's also different foundations like the Point Foundation that you can also reach out to and take a look at that also fund LGBTQ plus research. But I would first start with LGBTQ plus organizations or organizations that have a history of being very inclusive. So like AWP, to sort of look at what their funding mechanisms are and also their suggestions as well. So, Haley?
What resources would you find most helpful for someone who's just getting started in kind of becoming more educated in inclusivity and these sorts of topics in the research area? Like what would be the first couple recommendations you might make to someone who's trying to grow in this area?
I would say first is looking at the resources that your local LGBTQ plus community centers have about sexual and gender diversity. There are typically LGBTQ plus student centers on campuses or organizations that have also, they have compiled these resources and taken the time to do so. So I would recommend reaching out to do that. Some of the papers that I've mentioned today, I also think are very foundational. So Gregory Herrick's work is, he's done a lot of work on heterosexist bias and looking at this in research. And so I would definitely go to the researchers that have been doing this for a long time, like Sari Van Anders, Lisa Diamond, and other sorts of work there, but also looking at those local organizations. And then also moving to these bigger organizations that I've mentioned, like the Williams Institute or the Trevor Project, who can also provide some guidance for you if you're just entering this topic. But then I also want to point out that it's also really important if you're just starting out is maybe reach out to people who you can collaborate, who do have this expertise. And as I've sort of mentioned before, compensate them for their time, offer them authorship on a manuscript, or other sorts of ways that you can make the relationship more reciprocal. But, seek expertise from people who have it.
Great, thank you so much. From Sherry, what are some common mistakes researchers make when they move into this area of research?
So conflating sex, gender, relationship status. So conflating the terms together. I often see with intersectionality, I often don't see Kimberly Crenshaw or even other Black feminist theorists cited. So like making sure that your citation practices are the best for the types of theories that you're citing. So I would say that conflating people are conflating different aspects of sexual orientation or the LGBTQ plus community It's a mistake that people make. I also think that one of the reasons why I talked about intersectionality today and marginalization within marginalized groups is because that's also something else that I often see in research, is sort of not acknowledging that people can also be people can be Black and queer, people can be old and be queer. So not acknowledging that there are other sorts of facets of those identities that we can also be looking at, and maybe actually very, very critical to looking at when we're answering our research question.
Great. From Brittany, would you consider the BDSM group as a sexual orientation for some and an intersectional identity for others?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I would say that it, going back to what, Sari Van Anders had pointed out on that in her SET, is actually thinking about it more as a conceptual configurations. So thinking about everything broadly, and all of those sorts of things are entering into our sexual configurations, right? And so I would say that maybe for some people, this is something that they feel is very central to their identity and even a way that they identify. And for other people, it might just be a facet or less important part of their experience. And so that's why I mentioned using things like sexual configurations theory. So that way you can start to think about what aspects of sexuality, gender, or these other types of identities that you really, really want to measure.
Great. We have another question from Christy. Going back to your point about how we refer to groups, for example, homosexuals versus gay men, language matters. I've seen some researchers steering away from using the term other when attempting to be inclusive for folks to write in what they feel best describes them. What could be some other ways to frame other in a survey without othering?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I haven't seen many attempts to do so, but I have seen people just sort of maybe like a transparent disclosure, like if your identity is not mentioned here, please place it here, instead of just putting other : box. So giving people a little more direction there is sort of what I've seen. But again, as I mentioned before, we actually need a lot more work and measurement to understand what people actually prefer. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know if there has been an empirical paper that has looked at, the preferences of LGBTQ plus people specifically and how they feel when they see the word other in a demographic style question.
Awesome. Great. From Brittany, thank you for sharing. I'm new to LGBTQ plus research, and I'm very interested and excited to learn more about the sexual configurations theory. Another question for you, Lindsay. When you're thinking about some of these themes and how to practice inclusivity in research, do you notice any differences or tips or advice that you might provide for people who are doing online research versus in-person research?
Yeah, so is the question there sort of like what best practices in online or in-person research more broadly with
Yes.
LGBTQ plus groups? I think that best practices would definitely be things like measurement, making sure that your measurement is going to best capture what people's experiences are. Making sure people, if you're an in-person environment, like making sure that people feel comfortable in the environment as they're going in. And then with online environments too, providing like really detailed consent that people can withdraw if they feel uncomfortable. So I would just sort of defer to best research practices in those settings. And if you are really, really new to an area, some of the best advice I've gotten recently is to remind people that you can collaborate. There are people who have this expertise, and the best science is done in teams. And there really is no substitute for lived experience or expertise, which is also a borrowed quote.
Great, thank you. We do have time probably for a couple more questions. So if anyone would like to unmute or pop in the chat, I'm seeing, yes, the recording will be made available on the website. And also, how would you navigate a situation where a research group wants to do work in this area, but does not have anyone from any of the communities on board? It feels like it can end up tokenizing.
Yeah, it can. I think that there is a big difference between honoring and respecting someone's expertise and inviting them. And then also there's a versus, extracting information from them. So in part, it's just making sure the relationship is reciprocal, right? So I actually have a paper here that's bridging feminist psychology and open science. So that's actually a really great paper for giving you some guidance about informing best practices in your research. I also highly recommend, paying people, compensating people for their time. You can definitely pay people for them to do webinars or inform you if you're, needing a little more guidance in your self-education journey. It sounds like somebody's maybe struggling with a team that's a little more extractive. That's a little challenging because that's a little interpersonal stuff, but I would, again, just sort of default to evidence-based complaining and sort of, try to explain to people what the best practices are, and that even that there are empirical papers suggesting that these are our best practices. And then there's also lots of resources available about allyship, which, allyship is quickly becoming a dated term, even, so that can be acting in solidarity with a certain marginalized group. So I would definitely look at those resources. There's Sarah Ahmed's work, Sarah Ahmed talks a lot about the feminist practice of complaint, and she has a wonderful blog on it. And so I would definitely look at some of the researchers out there who are talking about complaint and how complaint can be a source of marginalization and also an important aspect of advocacy.
Wonderful. So I think we have time for maybe one more question if anyone would like to unmute or pop one in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to put Lindsay's email in the chat. So if questions come up, please feel free to reach out to her directly. And yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Lindsay, for the great presentation, and thank you all for tuning in today. Take care.
Have a great day, everyone.